In the serene suburb of Willow Creek, Washington, where life seemed as tranquil as the lush greenery in white picket fences, the Caldwell family appeared to be the epitome of success and harmony. Emma Caldwell, a 37-year-old web developer, was known for her warmth and talent. She had an uncanny ability to balance the demands of her growing business with her role as a devoted mother and community volunteer. Emma's days were filled with client meetings, designing websites that helped small businesses thrive, and after-school coding clubs she organized for neighborhood kids. Despite her busy schedule, she always found time for her two children, Lila, 11, and Noah, 9, who adored her unconditionally. Her husband, Luke Caldwell, seemed to match her stride in every way. At 41, he ran a thriving construction company that had built half the town's homes and businesses. Luke's name was often mentioned with respect in community circles. He sponsored local events, coached Little League, and was the first to offer help when a neighbor needed repairs. Together, the Caldwells were a picture-perfect family. They lived in a beautiful craftsman-style home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, their lives seemingly untouched by the struggles that plagued others. But behind the walls of their idyllic home, Emma began to notice cracks in their seemingly unbreakable foundation. At first, they were subtle: a late meeting here, an unusual phone call there. Luke, once the epitome of attentiveness, became increasingly distant. He brushed off her questions with vague excuses, the sparkle in his eyes replaced by a shadow of unease. Emma, naturally perceptive and attuned to her husband's moods, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, while tidying the kitchen after dinner, Emma overheard a fragment of a phone conversation Luke was having in his office. His voice, usually calm and composed, was strained, almost frantic. She caught only snippets: "The money will come soon, stop calling me here. Sophia can handle it." The name Sophia sent a chill down her spine. Sophia Bennett was her best friend, the one person Emma confided in about everything, including her growing concerns about Luke. Why was her name coming up in Luke's conversations about money? Despite the unease gnawing at her, Emma chose not to confront Luke immediately. Instead, she redirected her energy into planning a family trip to Yellowstone National Park, hoping the time away would help them reconnect. She spent hours researching the best hiking trails and lodges, imagining Lila and Noah marveling at geysers and wildlife. It was her way of preserving the facade of normalcy, clinging to the hope that the life they had built could still be saved. Yet, even as Emma planned the trip, her mind circled back to Sophia and Luke. She began piecing together fragments of conversations and inconsistencies in Luke's behavior. The picture they formed was far from comforting. Emma knew she had to find the truth, but what she didn't realize was that the answers she sought would shatter her world in ways she could never imagine. As she stood by the window one evening, gazing at the quiet cul-de-sac where her children played just days ago, Emma felt a wave of dread. The perfect life she had fought so hard to build was unraveling before her eyes. The storm brewing behind Luke's distant stares and secretive phone calls was about to engulf them all, leaving no one untouched. The following days in the Caldwell household moved with an eerie blend of routine and tension. From the outside, life looked unchanged. Emma would get Lila and Noah ready for school, preparing their favorite breakfasts, pancakes for Lila and oatmeal with berries for Noah. Her mornings buzzed with activity, balancing parenting, her work, and a strong presence in the community. Neighbors admired her for it, calling her a supermom, the woman who could seemingly do it all with a smile. By late morning, after the kids were at school, Emma would retreat to her home office, a cozy room she had meticulously designed to be her creative sanctuary. From this corner of the world, she developed websites, orchestrated marketing campaigns, and crafted digital storefronts that left her clients delighted. Her latest project for a startup skincare company was the biggest one yet, a milestone she hoped would take her business to the next level. But despite her drive and the satisfaction she felt from her work, the peculiar changes in Luke's behavior haunted her mind. Since their marriage, Emma had grown familiar with every facet of Luke's personality. He was predictable, in a comforting way, a steady provider and a loving husband. But now, There was an edge to him, something dark and unsettling that emerged when he thought she wasn't looking. Luke's once lively eyes now held a weariness she couldn't ignore. He had started coming home later than usual, always with a barely believable excuse, and though he tried to keep his explanations light-hearted, his smile never reached his eyes. Emma's suspicions grew, but she clung to the idea that it might just be work stress. After all, running a construction company came with its share of burdens, and maybe he was simply struggling with a demanding client. But her patience was tested on a Thursday night, when he arrived home well past midnight, smelling faintly of alcohol and something else, an unfamiliar perfume. Emma asked him, half-jokingly, if he had stopped by a bar after work, but Luke only offered a dismissive smile, brushing past her into the bedroom without a word. A chill crept through Emma. She felt him slipping further away, like sand through her fingers. It was during one of their Saturday morning rituals, going through family plans over breakfast, that Emma tried to broach the topic more directly. She suggested they spend more time together, that maybe he could take a few days off for the Yellowstone trip. Luke's reaction was defensive, almost hostile. "I'm under a lot of pressure, Emma. Not all of us can take a break whenever we feel like it," he retorted, his tone laced with irritation. Emma felt the sting of his words, and something in her cracked. From that moment, she began paying closer attention, piecing together his actions in search of an explanation. There were brief, whispered phone calls at odd hours, where Luke would lower his voice and retreat to his office, shutting the door firmly behind him. She caught fragments of his conversations. "I've already told you, it's complicated, just stay out of it." The calm and collected man she married was vanishing before her eyes, replaced by a stranger with secrets. At night, while Luke slept, Emma's mind raced with questions. One night, as she was shutting down her computer, she noticed a message notification on his phone left charging on the kitchen counter. The screen briefly lit up, revealing a single name, Sophia. Emma's heart sank as a familiar dread filled her. Sophia had been her closest confidant for years, the friend she trusted with everything. They had shared laughter, tears, and countless coffee dates. She had never once questioned her loyalty. But the fragments of conversation and Luke's evasive behavior pointed toward a connection that was impossible to ignore. Emma's instincts told her that something terrible was brewing, that her life was on the verge of an unthinkable revelation. She found herself avoiding direct confrontations with Luke, instead sinking deeper into the routine of her life, as if clinging to a sense of normalcy could stave off the storm looming over her. She attended PTA meetings, volunteered at Lila and Noah's school events, and organized community bake sales. To everyone else, she was the epitome of composure, a devoted wife and mother whose life was enviably stable. But beneath her calm exterior, a quiet rage and sorrow began to grow. Each time she saw Luke with his familiar, distant smile, or noticed the new messages from Sophia, the tension within her tightened. By day, she played her role flawlessly, a pillar of the community and the glue of her family. But by night, when she was alone, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the possible betrayals unfolding around her. She knew her life was changing, inch by inch, and that whatever was behind Luke's secrets was tearing at the seams of the life they had built together. And so, while life continued as usual on the surface, a darker undercurrent ran through Emma's days. She couldn't shake the feeling that her perfect life was nothing but a beautiful illusion, one that could shatter at any moment. In an attempt to hold on to the fragments of her family, Emma poured herself into the details of their Yellowstone trip. Planning this getaway became her safe harbor, a distraction from the gnawing doubts and unanswered questions. Every night, she would sit at the kitchen table with a laptop and a pile of travel guides, scrolling through lists of scenic trails, family-friendly lodges, and must-see spots. She imagined Lila's wide-eyed excitement as she spotted a bison for the first time or Noah's fascination with the geysers. It was meant to be a break, a chance to restore the warmth and trust that had quietly eroded between her and Luke. If anything could bring them back together, she believed, it was the majesty of nature. Emma threw herself into every detail of the trip, perhaps with more intensity than it warranted. She spent hours researching the best locations for family photos, envisioning memories captured against the dramatic backdrop of Yellowstone's pristine landscapes. She even invested in a new camera, intending to photograph the family moments that could later be cherished, a tangible proof of happiness, or perhaps, she feared, of what had been. As the days passed, she convinced herself that the trip would be their salvation, a fresh start. At the same time, Emma's professional life was taking an exciting turn. She had recently landed a contract with an organic skincare startup, a project she had been vying for months. This wasn't just another job, it was a stepping stone toward growing her business into something truly impactful. The startup had hired her to revamp their online presence and lead a marketing campaign that would elevate their brand in the competitive skincare market. Her days were now filled with brainstorming sessions, prototype designs, and countless hours spent perfecting each detail of the website. Her creativity flourished, and the praise from the company gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Despite the professional high, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking in the background. She felt the quiet menace of Luke's secrets weighing heavily, an invisible tension threaded through every interaction. Even as she poured her energy into designing the perfect website and finalizing the Yellowstone plans, she found herself glancing at the clock, wondering when Luke would come home and whether he would have yet another excuse. The anticipation for the family trip became a bittersweet mix of hope and dread. On one hand, she longed for the closeness that had once defined their marriage and hoped that a change of scenery would remind them of their bond. But on the other hand, every day leading up to the trip made her realize just how deeply fractured their relationship had become. Luke showed little interest in her plans, offering lukewarm responses when she showed him her itinerary. "That sounds nice, Emma," he'd say, barely looking up from his phone. His indifference stung, but she forced herself to stay optimistic, holding on to the belief that time away might reignite the spark they once had. Meanwhile, Emma continued to play her role in the community with poise. She attended school events, led the coding club for the kids at Westfield Elementary, and baked treats for the school's fundraiser. Her cookies and cakes were a hit, and the other parents admired her dedication. No one could have guessed the turmoil that simmered beneath her cheerful exterior. To everyone else, she was still the Emma they knew, devoted, hardworking, and kind. She was determined to keep it that way, to keep up appearances, if only to convince herself that everything was fine. And then there was Sophia. The betrayal Emma feared lingered in the background of her every thought, souring even her brightest moments. Sophia's presence, once comforting, now felt like a shadow lurking in her periphery. Emma replayed memories with Sophia, scanning every interaction, every laugh shared over coffee, for clues she might have missed. How could she have been so blind? Sophia had been her confidant, the person she leaned on when Luke's behavior first began to change. Now, the mere thought of her friend brought a bitter taste to her mouth. Emma's life was an elaborate act of balancing hope with denial. In front of Lila and Noah, she was still the mother who would take them on a trip they'd remember for the rest of their lives. To her clients, she was the professional who delivered beyond expectations, her designs reflecting a passion and care that masked her personal despair. And to the community, she was the picture of reliability, always willing to help and lend a hand. Yet beneath the facade, Emma was crumbling. Every smile, every plan, every act of kindness felt like part of a fragile disguise that could shatter with a single revelation. She knew, deep down, that her world was on the brink of collapse. Her family, her career, her friendships, all were woven together with threads that felt ready to unravel. As she finalized the itinerary for Yellowstone, an ominous thought flickered at the edge of her mind: perhaps this trip wasn't a new beginning. Perhaps it was the last chance she'd ever have to preserve the life she had fought so hard to build. It was a crisp, quiet morning when Oliver Hayes, the Caldwells' next-door neighbor, set out on his usual early jog. Oliver, a retired firefighter with a meticulous routine, had known the family for nearly a decade. He'd watched Lila and Noah grow from toddlers to lively children, and he'd shared countless conversations with Emma over the years. The familiarity and safety of the neighborhood made what he was about to discover all the more jarring. As Oliver jogged past the Caldwell's home, he noticed something unusual: the garage door was partially open. It struck him as odd since Emma was diligent about security. She always kept the garage door closed, a small but steadfast habit of hers. He slowed to a walk, peering curiously at the gap. From where he stood, he could make out an unusual shadow on the garage floor, a dark, unmoving shape that filled him with unease. Approaching cautiously, Oliver's heartbeat quickened as he got closer. What he saw when he reached the door would be seared into his mind forever. There, lying in a pool of blood, was Emma Caldwell, her body motionless and bruised, her clothes stained red. A heavy wrench lay nearby, covered in blood, its weight and brutal proximity hinting that it was the weapon used in the horrific act. Oliver froze, his years of training in emergency response momentarily overtaken by shock. The gruesome reality of what lay before him shattered the calm of the morning. After a split second, his instincts kicked in. He reached for his phone with trembling hands, dialing 911. His voice was urgent but steady as he described the scene to the operator, his mind racing through the steps he knew he had to take. Oliver stayed near the entrance, ensuring no one else stumbled into the grim scene. In the eerie stillness, he felt the weight of Emma's final moments pressing down on him. He replayed the sight of her lifeless form, the blood pooling beneath her, the wrench that had stolen her life, a picture of unimaginable violence that seemed so far removed from the Emma he had known. Within minutes, the blaring sirens of the Fairview Police Department shattered the early morning silence. Officers secured the scene, and detectives Laura Mitchell and Ryan Carter, both seasoned investigators known for their sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of justice, arrived shortly after. The two detectives exchanged a grim glance as they surveyed the scene. It was a sight they had seen before, but never in this neighborhood, never involving someone so beloved within the community. Laura Mitchell, a tall woman with piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing, took immediate command of the investigation. She meticulously inspected the wrench, noting the blood and strands of hair clinging to its handle. Every detail was documented, each bloodstain carefully photographed, the brutality of the attack unmistakable. The garage walls, once spotless and orderly, were now marred with dark smudges and blood spatters, evidence of a struggle that Emma had fought with all her strength. Meanwhile, Ryan Carter moved to interview Oliver. The detective's voice was calm but probing as he gathered details about the discovery. Oliver recounted the morning, describing how he had noticed the partially open garage door and the shock of finding Emma inside. His hands shook slightly as he recalled the image, the helplessness he felt despite years of training in emergency response. She was just lying there, he murmured, his voice trailing off as he struggled to process the reality of what he'd seen. As word of Emma's death spread, the tranquil neighborhood was rocked to its core. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups, their faces pale with shock and sorrow. Emma had been a beacon of kindness, a fixture in their lives. It was inconceivable that something so violent could touch someone like her. For many, the image of her smiling face from community gatherings and school events was sharply juxtaposed with the brutal reality of her death. Inside the house, Lila and Noah were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding outside. Laura and Ryan, understanding the gravity of the situation, took immediate steps to ensure the children's safety. They were carefully escorted from their home and taken to their grandparents' house, shielded from the horror that had forever changed their lives. The stark contrast between the innocence inside the house and the bloodshed in the garage underscored the magnitude of the tragedy. As the detectives combed through the scene, they found Emma's cell phone on a nearby workbench. It was an unexpected discovery that immediately became a priority piece of evidence. Laura and Ryan hoped it would contain clues, messages, calls, or perhaps even a digital breadcrumb that would lead them to Emma's final moments. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Emma may have known her attacker, a detail that narrowed their list of suspects and cast a long shadow over those closest to her. The detectives continued their methodical search, noting every detail that could aid their investigation. Blood samples were collected, fingerprints meticulously dusted for, and DNA swabs taken from key areas around the garage. Each piece of evidence was another step toward understanding the horror that had unfolded here. As they worked, Laura felt a deepening resolve to find justice for Emma, a woman who had deserved none of this. When their investigation in the garage was complete, Laura and Ryan regrouped outside, reviewing their findings and next steps. With no forced entry and the intimate nature of the crime, the detectives knew they were likely dealing with someone Emma trusted. Her husband, Luke, quickly emerged as a person of interest, his recent behavior and financial troubles raising questions that demanded answers. As the morning sun rose over Willow Creek, casting its gentle light on a neighborhood that had been forever altered, Laura and Ryan prepared to confront the secrets hidden within the Caldwell family. Detectives Laura Mitchell and Ryan Carter wasted no time diving into the investigation. The initial evidence from the scene told a story of brutality and betrayal. With no signs of forced entry, it was clear that Emma's attacker was someone she had trusted enough to let close. This narrowed the focus to her inner circle, family, friends, and anyone who might have had access to her home. The wrench found near Emma's lifeless body was the first piece of critical evidence. Forensics confirmed it was the murder weapon, its handle smeared with blood and strands of Emma's hair. Fingerprint analysis began immediately, while the detectives examined the positioning of the tool, suggesting it had been left in haste after the crime. Laura couldn't shake the impression that the attack was personal. The ferocity of the blows pointed not to a random intruder, but to someone driven by anger or desperation. As the day unfolded, the investigation's attention shifted to Luke Caldwell. Emma's husband, the man who should have been her protector, was conspicuously absent from the home that morning. His alibi was flimsy at best. He claimed he had been working late at his office and then gone straight to bed upon returning home. Yet, there were no witnesses to corroborate his story. When questioned by Laura and Ryan later that afternoon, Luke seemed composed but distant, his answers rehearsed and lacking emotion. "Did you notice anything unusual about Emma's behavior recently?" Laura asked, her sharp eyes locked on Luke's every twitch and gesture. Luke shrugged, his tone nonchalant. "She was busy, as usual. She had her projects, the kids, the trip she was planning. We didn't have as much time to talk as we used to." Ryan, who had been silently observing, leaned forward. "What about you, Luke? Did you have anything weighing on your mind? Anything that might have caused tension between the two of you?" Luke's jaw tightened for a moment before he forced a smile. "I've been stressed with work. Running a company isn't easy. But that's normal, right? It's nothing we couldn't handle." The detectives exchanged a glance. Luke's words were technically neutral, but his demeanor raised red flags. His answers felt calculated, his body language defensive. Laura noted how his hands fidgeted whenever Emma's name was mentioned, and his eyes darted away when asked direct questions about their marriage. As the detectives delved deeper into Luke's background, troubling patterns began to emerge. Financial records revealed the first crack in his facade. Luke's construction company, once thought to be thriving, was in significant debt. Large sums of money had been funneled through accounts with little explanation. Payments to unfamiliar entities raised suspicions of money laundering or other illicit activities. Moreover, Luke had taken out multiple loans against their family home, something Emma likely hadn't known about. Then there were the phone records. Luke had been in frequent contact with Sophia Bennett, Emma's best friend. The sheer volume of calls and messages between the two raised alarms. The content of their conversations, while not explicitly incriminating, hinted at something far deeper than a platonic relationship. Sophia's name had already appeared in Emma's suspicions before her death, and now it seemed undeniable that she was entangled in Luke's secrets. When Laura and Ryan confronted Luke about Sophia, his carefully constructed calm began to crumble. "We've been friends for years," he said, his voice defensive. "We talk about work. She's in real estate, and sometimes I help her with renovation plans. Ryan pressed further. Friends, sure. But does Emma know about these conversations? Does she know how many late-night calls you've had with Sophia? Luke's face flushed, and his jaw clenched. I don't know what you're implying, but Sophia had nothing to do with this. Leave her out of it. The detectives noted his reaction with interest. Luke's protectiveness over Sophia only deepened their suspicion, suggesting a personal connection he was desperate to hide. They began piecing together a motive, financial strain, the threat of exposure, and a relationship that might have driven Luke to remove any obstacles in his path. Meanwhile, the community's perception of Luke began to shift. Neighbors who once admired him for his generosity now whispered about his temper and the tension they'd noticed between him and Emma. Oliver Hayes, the neighbor who found Emma, recounted moments when Luke appeared irritable and detached in recent weeks. He was on edge, Oliver said during questioning. Like he was carrying a weight he couldn't handle. As the evidence mounted, Luke's double life became increasingly clear. The once respected businessman was now the prime suspect in a crime that had left the town of Willow Creek reeling. For Laura and Ryan, the path forward was clear: uncover more about Luke's financial dealings, his relationship with Sophia, and the pressures that might have pushed him to commit murder. The man who had appeared to be Emma's rock was now the center of their investigation, his secrets unraveling as the detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the truth. As the investigation into Emma Caldwell's brutal murder progressed, Luke Caldwell found himself caught in a tightening web of suspicion. His alibi had faltered under scrutiny, his financial troubles became public knowledge, and his connection with Sophia Bennett, the best friend of his late wife, was anything but innocent. Now, it was time for the detectives to confront him more directly. On the afternoon of the fourth day since Emma's body was discovered, Luke was brought in for questioning. The air in the interrogation room was thick with tension as Detective Laura Mitchell and Detective Ryan Carter took their seats across from him. Luke, still maintaining his composed exterior, sat rigidly in a chair. His hands, however, betrayed his nervousness, his fingers tapping against the table in a rapid, almost imperceptible rhythm. Laura leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Luke, we need to go over your movements on the night of Emma's murder, she said, her voice calm but firm. You've already told us that you were at your office, but there's no one who can confirm that. We need the truth. Luke shifted uncomfortably but quickly composed himself. I already told you everything. I was at the office. I worked late, had a meeting with some contractors, and then I came home. I didn't get in until after midnight. Emma was already in bed when I got back. Ryan studied him carefully, his voice low but insistent. The thing is, Luke, your story doesn't add up. We've been through the phone records, the financial records, and now the evidence from the scene. Emma's body was found in the garage, and there's no sign of a struggle inside the house. The only plausible explanation is that she knew her killer. Someone she trusted enough to let in. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. What were you hiding, Luke? Luke's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. I'm not hiding anything, he said through gritted teeth. I told you, this has nothing to do with me. Laura exchanged a glance with Ryan. It was clear that Luke was beginning to unravel under the pressure, but he still wasn't willing to break. They needed more. More proof, more inconsistencies, anything that would crack the shell he had so carefully constructed around himself. We've also discovered something else, Luke, Laura continued, her tone steady but cutting. We found the debts, substantial amounts of money you owe. There were payments to offshore accounts, transactions that look like they're tied to illegal activities. Money laundering, Luke. And that's not all. You took out loans on your home, draining everything you had, all while pretending everything was fine. What were you planning to do if Emma found out? Luke's face turned pale. His lips tightened, and his fists clenched in his lap. He didn't respond immediately, his silence more telling than any answer he could have given. Ryan leaned in, his voice sharp. This is your chance, Luke. We know about the money problems. We know about your dealings with Sophia. We know about the lies. So why don't you just tell us the truth? We're trying to understand what happened to Emma. Luke's resolve faltered for a moment. His eyes flickered with what seemed like doubt or guilt, but he quickly masked it with anger. I didn't kill Emma. I loved her. I still do, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I had my problems, yeah. But I didn't hurt her. Laura took a deep breath, her tone softening slightly. We're not here to tear your life apart, Luke. We're here to find out what happened. We want to know what led to Emma's death, why things went so wrong. But you're not making it easy for yourself. At that moment, Ryan handed Laura a set of documents. They were printed copies of Luke's financial records, evidence they had gathered from the company accounts. As she skimmed through the papers, a new detail stood out, a large, unexplained deposit into Luke's personal account, a sum that seemed to appear overnight, just weeks before Emma's death. It was a substantial amount, too much to be dismissed as coincidence. Laura looked up at Luke. Where did this money come from, Luke? Why was it deposited into your account? Luke shifted in his chair, his eyes darting away. His mouth tightened again, but this time, he didn't speak. He simply stared at the table, his jaw set and his silence deafening. Ryan pressed further. You've been hiding things from us, haven't you? Sophia knew about your financial troubles. She knew about your affair. She knew everything, Luke. And that money, it wasn't for you. It was for someone else, wasn't it? Who's been helping you cover this up? At the mention of Sophia's name, Luke flinched. It was a small gesture, but enough for Laura and Ryan to notice. It was the first time he had reacted so visibly to any of the accusations. His lips trembled slightly, and for the briefest moment, Laura saw something she hadn't expected, fear. He exhaled slowly and finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want her to know. I didn't want Emma to know. I didn't want anyone to know how deep I was in. I was going to fix it. I thought I could fix it. I didn't mean for this to happen. Ryan's eyes narrowed, and he stood up, moving closer to Luke. You thought you could fix it? By killing her? His voice was low but laced with contempt. You thought that was the answer? Luke's face crumpled, and for the first time, his guard cracked. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was supposed to be a fresh start. A chance for us to move on. I didn't think. Think? Laura interrupted sharply. You didn't think about your wife. Your kids. Your family. Luke's head shot up, his eyes wild. I was desperate. I couldn't lose everything, not like that. Not because of my mistakes. The room fell silent. Luke's confession hung in the air, a terrible admission of guilt mixed with a confused, panicked sense of regret. Emma's death had been a consequence of his lies, his desperation, and the web of deceit he had woven to hide his mounting financial disaster. But as Laura and Ryan looked at him, they knew that Luke was only beginning to understand the full gravity of what he had done. The investigation had only scratched the surface. The deeper they went, the clearer it became, Luke Caldwell wasn't just a grieving husband, he was a man willing to do anything to cover up his secrets. And now, the truth was finally starting to emerge. Sophia Bennett had always been a fixture in Emma Caldwell's life. For years, she had been Emma's closest friend, confidant, and trusted ally. They had shared everything from motherhood struggles to career ambitions, and their bond was as solid as any friendship could be. So when Emma began to suspect something was wrong, it was hard for her to imagine that the person she confided in most, Sophia, could be part of the unraveling disaster that would ultimately claim her life. But as the investigation into Emma's death deepened, it became increasingly clear that Sophia was far more involved than anyone had initially suspected. Detective Laura Mitchell and Detective Ryan Carter had already begun to connect the dots between Luke Caldwell's suspicious behavior, his financial troubles, and the strange and secretive relationship he had with Sophia. The question now was how far the web of deceit stretched, and what role Sophia had played in the events leading to Emma's death. Sophia had always been an ambitious woman, determined to make her mark in the competitive world of real estate. She had built a successful career, known for her sharp eye for properties and her ability to close deals. On the surface, she seemed the picture of professional success, outgoing, polished, and always present at social gatherings. She and Emma had attended PDA meetings together, hosted barbecues, and participated in charity events, always side by side. However, as Laura and Ryan began to delve deeper into the dynamics between the three, they uncovered troubling secrets. Sophia's relationship with Luke Caldwell, once believed to be purely professional, had long since evolved into something much more intimate. The detectives discovered a series of cryptic text messages, late-night phone calls, and secret meetings that confirmed their affair had been ongoing for over a year. What began as an innocent working relationship had gradually turned into something darker, fueled by mutual need and desire. For Sophia, it was not just an affair, it was a chance at a new life, a chance to escape the constraints of her own marriage and perhaps even secure her future in a way that had been elusive for her. When Laura and Ryan finally confronted Sophia with the evidence of her affair with Luke, she was noticeably shaken. It wasn't just the affair that had the detectives on edge, it was the realization that Sophia's motivations ran deeper than simple infidelity. There was more at play here, and Emma's murder seemed to be part of a much larger picture. During the first round of questioning, Sophia was guarded, but not outright hostile. "Yes, I had an affair with Luke. But that doesn't mean I had anything to do with Emma's death," she said, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. She attempted to defend herself, but there was an underlying tension that could not be ignored. It was as though she was trying to maintain her image, to distance herself from the horror of Emma's murder while still protecting the fragile secret she and Luke had kept hidden. The detectives pushed further, asking Sophia about the money Luke had received, large, unexplained sums deposited into his accounts, money that seemed to have no legitimate source. At first, she feigned ignorance, claiming she had no knowledge of Luke's financial troubles. "I don't know anything about his business or the loans. I didn't know he was in that much debt," she insisted. But when they presented the phone records, showing how often she and Luke had been in contact in the weeks leading up to Emma's death, Sophia's facade began to crack. The messages between them weren't just romantic, they were laden with discussions about the future, about their plans to escape the tangled web of lies they had both built. There were conversations about how to hide Luke's financial mess from Emma, how to keep the affair secret, and how they both believed that Emma's suspicions were growing. Sophia's nervousness grew as the detectives pressed on, their questions becoming more pointed. "You knew about Luke's debts, didn't you, Sophia? You knew how desperate he was getting. Was that the reason for the affair? Was it to control him, to have him where you wanted him?" Sophia's hands trembled as she grasped the edge of the table, her eyes darting away. "No. It wasn't like that. I loved him. I never meant for any of this to happen," she stammered, her words losing their conviction. "Yes, I knew about his financial troubles. But I never wanted Emma to die. I swear, I didn't want any of this." Her voice wavered, a mixture of guilt and fear creeping into her tone. It was then that the detectives noticed the subtle but revealing shift in her behavior. As the interrogation wore on, Sophia's demeanor began to change. She wasn't just trying to cover up an affair, she was trying to cover up something far more sinister. There was a flicker of something darker in her eyes, a sense of panic mixed with the cold realization that she was now involved in a murder investigation. The fear in her eyes grew as she realized the full extent of what was being uncovered, and how the truth might come back to haunt her. Sophia's motive for participating in the affair with Luke was now clearer. She had not just been seeking love or comfort, she had been seeking control. Luke's financial instability had been a threat to both of their futures, and together they had plotted to keep Emma in the dark. But when Emma had grown suspicious, when she had started to dig deeper into the cracks in their lives, their world began to collapse. The affair had already driven a wedge between Emma and Luke, but it wasn't enough for them. In their desperation, they turned to more extreme measures. As the detectives continued to dig, they uncovered more of Sophia's role in the events leading up to Emma's death. She had been a part of the plan to keep Emma unaware of Luke's true situation, but when things began to spiral out of control, she had become complicit in the darkest turn of events. What had started as an affair had escalated into a dangerous game of deceit, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. Sophia's role in Emma's murder would soon become undeniable. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place: her involvement with Luke, the financial chaos they had tried to hide, and the desperate decisions made to maintain their secret. As the investigation unfolded, one thing was clear: Sophia Bennett was no longer just a witness, she was a key player in a crime that had shattered a family and destroyed the lives of those involved. The investigation into Emma Caldwell's murder was progressing rapidly, and yet there was something missing, a crucial piece of the puzzle that was still eluding the detectives. They had uncovered the financial mess that Luke Caldwell was hiding, the affair with Sophia Bennett, and the tension that had been building for months, but it wasn't enough. They needed someone who could fill in the gaps, someone who could provide a clearer picture of the Caldwell family's unraveling. Little did they know, the answers they sought would come from an unexpected source: Ethan Hunter. Ethan Hunter was a private investigator, hired by Emma just weeks before her death. He had been a quiet figure in the background of the case, his involvement overlooked by the detectives at first. His role seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things, until the details of his investigation began to surface. Ethan had been hired by Emma after she began suspecting Luke of infidelity and financial mismanagement. She had noticed the warning signs long before her suspicions were confirmed, and as a woman who prided herself on her intuition, Emma had taken the prudent step of hiring an investigator to get to the bottom of things. Emma had known that something wasn't right in her marriage, and she had been determined to uncover the truth. She had suspected Luke of having an affair, but the more she learned, the darker the reality became. Ethan's investigation revealed a trail of lies, a web of deceit that involved not just Luke, but Sophia as well. Emma had planned to confront Luke with the evidence Ethan had gathered, but her tragic death put an abrupt end to that plan. When Ethan first became involved in the case, he had no idea how deeply intertwined he would become with the events surrounding Emma's murder. As he worked to uncover the details of Luke's financial misdeeds and the affair with Sophia, he inadvertently stumbled upon a much larger story, a tale of desperation, betrayal, and murder. He had no idea that his investigation would soon lead him to a confrontation with the very people he had been hired to investigate. It wasn't until the detectives began to review Ethan's findings that they realized just how significant his role had been. As they sifted through his reports and evidence, it became clear that Ethan had been much closer to the truth than anyone had initially realized. He had already discovered the extent of Luke's financial troubles, the deepening affair with Sophia, and the growing rift between Emma and her husband. Ethan had even managed to document conversations between Luke and Sophia that hinted at their plans to escape their respective lives and start anew. The detective sat down with Ethan for the first time, hoping to learn more about the work he had done and how it could potentially shed light on Emma's murder. Ethan, a man in his mid-40s, was a seasoned investigator with years of experience. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his relentless pursuit of the truth. His reputation in the industry was impeccable, and he had a reputation for never leaving a stone unturned. During the interview, Ethan came across as calm and collected, though there was an underlying intensity in his demeanor. He knew that his findings could hold the key to solving Emma's case, but he also understood the gravity of the situation. Emma was no longer around to testify to the truths he had uncovered, and it was now up to him to share what he had learned. "I was hired to investigate Luke's financials and his personal life," Ethan explained. Emma had suspected something was wrong for a long time. She'd noticed the late-night meetings, the unexplained absences, and the shift in Luke's behavior. When she hired me, she wasn't sure what she'd find, but she knew something was off. Ethan detailed the timeline of his investigation, recounting how he had uncovered mounting debt, suspicious transactions, and a series of shady business dealings that Luke had been involved in. But it was the affair with Sophia that had raised the most concern. Ethan had gathered evidence of their relationship, including secret meetings and passionate exchanges that Emma had never known about. He had presented Emma with the evidence just a few days before her death, and she had planned to confront Luke with it. But she had never gotten the chance. "I never expected things to escalate like this," Ethan said quietly, his gaze fixed on the table. "I thought that once Emma had the proof, she'd be able to confront Luke and make some decisions. I didn't think it would end in murder." Laura Mitchell and Ryan Carter listened intently as Ethan spoke, realizing just how much more they needed to learn about the depth of Luke's desperation and his involvement with Sophia. Ethan's findings were pivotal in piecing together the motive behind Emma's murder. It was clear now that the affair had been a central part of the plot, but it wasn't just about infidelity. It was about money, power, and a future that neither Luke nor Sophia were willing to lose. Emma had stood in the way of that future, and her death had become the unfortunate solution to their problems. As the interrogation progressed, it became increasingly apparent that Ethan's investigation had set in motion a chain of events that led directly to Emma's murder. His discovery of Luke's financial troubles had already put the man on edge, and the exposure of the affair with Sophia had pushed him to the breaking point. But it wasn't just the financial ruin or the affair that had caused the murder. It was the fear of exposure, the fear that Emma would leave him, take the children, and expose the life he had worked so hard to hide. Ethan was a key figure in the case now, and as he continued to provide crucial evidence, it became clear that he was not just an observer in the story of Emma's death, he was a vital part of the investigation. The clues he had uncovered, the pieces of the puzzle he had assembled, were integral to understanding how and why Emma had been killed. As the investigation moved forward, Ethan's role would continue to evolve. He wasn't just a private investigator anymore, he was a key player in the pursuit of justice for Emma. And as the truth about what had happened to Emma Caldwell came to light, it was clear that Ethan Hunter's persistence in uncovering the dark secrets of the Caldwell family would ultimately help bring her killers to justice. As the investigation into Emma Caldwell's murder advanced, the weight of the evidence against Luke Caldwell grew too significant to ignore. The detectives had pieced together a damning case: Luke's financial ruin, his affair with Sophia Bennett, the mounting pressures that had led him to act with increasing desperation, all converged to create a portrait of a man willing to commit murder to preserve the life he had built. Luke Caldwell had tried to maintain the facade of a grieving husband, but the cracks in his story had become undeniable. Financial records showed a pattern of deceit and mismanagement. Text messages between Luke and Sophia revealed their deep connection, confirming that the affair was more than a mere emotional escape, it had become a critical factor in the unfolding tragedy. The murder weapon, a bloodied wrench found just feet from Emma's lifeless body, pointed to someone familiar with the victim, someone Emma trusted. The tipping point came when Luke's own confession, albeit partial, was coupled with the growing pile of circumstantial evidence. Detective Laura Mitchell had spent hours reviewing the details of Luke's behavior, his attempt to cover up the financial mess, his increasingly erratic behavior, and his growing tension with Emma. But it was the chilling admission, the admission that Luke had feared Emma would uncover his lies and ruin his chance at a new life with Sophia, that provided the final pieces of the puzzle. The decision was made. Luke Caldwell would be arrested, and the evidence against him would be laid bare. The entire town of Willow Creek, which had once seen him as a model husband and businessman, now watched in shock as the man they had trusted was taken into custody for the murder of his wife. On the morning of his arrest, Luke was at his office, as usual. The business he had once been so proud of had been hanging on by a thread, and he had spent much of the past few days trying to manage the fallout from the investigation. When Detective Mitchell and Detective Carter arrived at the construction site where Luke had been overseeing some repairs, they found him at his desk, reviewing blueprints and answering emails. His usual composure was gone, the stress of the investigation had taken its toll. Detective Mitchell stepped into the office, her expression unreadable. "Luke Caldwell," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You are under arrest for the murder of your wife, Emma Caldwell." Luke's face drained of color. He stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his jacket. His eyes darted between the two detectives, his mouth opening and closing as if to say something, but no words came out. Finally, he spoke, his voice hollow. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Ryan Carter stepped forward, his hand on Luke's arm, guiding him toward the door. "You'll have plenty of time to explain that in court," he said. "For now, we're taking you in." As Luke was escorted out of the office and into the back of a squad car, the news spread quickly throughout Willow Creek. The small town, which had once been home to a family considered the epitome of suburban perfection, was now reeling from the shocking arrest. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers who had once admired Luke were left questioning everything they thought they knew. How could someone who seemed so trustworthy, so devoted, be capable of such a horrific act? The arrest was just the beginning of a long and painful legal journey for Luke Caldwell. The case against him was strong, but it was clear that the prosecution would need to present a compelling argument to secure a conviction. The courtroom, as the trial approached, was filled with tension as the community braced for the public revelation of what had really happened in the Caldwell household. The prosecution, led by an experienced district attorney, began to piece together their case with precision. The evidence of Luke's financial misdeeds was clear: loans, hidden debts, and illegal activities meant that his motives weren't just about betrayal, they were about survival. The affair with Sophia, which had driven a wedge between Luke and Emma, was another key aspect of the prosecution's case. They argued that Luke's desperation to protect his secret life with Sophia, combined with his mounting debts, led him to take extreme measures to eliminate the one person who could ruin everything, Emma. Sophia Bennett, once a trusted friend of Emma's, was called to testify. Her presence in the courtroom was a shock to the community, especially when it became clear that her affair with Luke had been a significant part of the motive. Under oath, Sophia revealed the details of her relationship with Luke, including the conversations they had about leaving their respective spouses and starting a new life together. But as the questioning grew more intense, it became clear that Sophia's role was more than just a passive participant. The prosecution hinted at her involvement in the planning of Emma's death, though no direct evidence tied her to the actual murder. She was given a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation, but her testimony would forever mark her as an accomplice. The defense, on the other hand, sought to paint Luke as a man who had been caught in a web of financial ruin and emotional distress. They argued that the pressure had driven him to the edge, and while they did not deny his involvement in the affair, they suggested that the murder was a tragic accident, something that had escalated out of control in the heat of a volatile argument. They tried to discredit the forensic evidence, suggesting that it was inconclusive and open to interpretation. However, the prosecution's case was airtight. They presented forensic evidence that linked Luke directly to the crime scene: the bloody wrench, the fingerprints, and the DNA, all pointed back to him. Text messages and financial records painted a picture of a man who had become desperate and who had, ultimately, taken matters into his own hands. The jury listened intently, as each piece of the puzzle fell into place. After several weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The community of Willow Creek waited anxiously, knowing that the trial would forever alter the lives of the Caldwell family, and the entire town. Luke Caldwell, once a respected businessman and a devoted husband in the eyes of many, now stood on the precipice of a life sentence for the brutal murder of his wife. When the jury returned with their verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The foreman stood and delivered the decision: guilty of first-degree murder. The room erupted in a mixture of relief and shock. For Emma's family, it was a bittersweet victory, justice for Emma, but nothing could bring her back. For Luke's parents, friends, and those who had once admired him, the verdict was a crushing blow. The man they had trusted was now a convicted killer, and his life, along with the lives of everyone involved, would be forever changed. Luke Caldwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community of Willow Creek, forever scarred by the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst, would never forget the story of betrayal, greed, and murder that had shattered one of their own. And as the court proceedings ended, the truth had finally been revealed. Emma Caldwell's legacy, though marked by her tragic end, would live on in the pursuit of justice and the fight against the darkness that had hidden behind a seemingly perfect life. The verdict had been delivered, and the wheels of justice had ground to a halt for Luke Caldwell. But for those who had been left in the wake of Emma Caldwell's tragic death, the journey toward healing was only just beginning. Willow Creek, a community that had once seen the Caldwell family as the epitome of success, was now grappling with the brutal reality that one of their own had committed such a heinous crime. The shockwaves of Emma's murder would reverberate for years to come, reshaping relationships, lives, and the very fabric of the small town. As the trial concluded, and Luke was led away in handcuffs to begin his life sentence in prison, those who knew Emma began to reflect on the life she had lived and the legacy she had left behind. For her children, Lila and Noah, the pain was profound. They were now without a mother, their innocence forever shattered by the brutality of the world around them. But even in their grief, there was a glimmer of hope. The two children, though young, had a strong support system in their grandparents, who would raise them with love and care. The community, despite the dark shadow of the tragedy, rallied around them, offering as much comfort as they could during their difficult transition. Emma had been more than just a wife and mother, she had been a beacon of warmth and kindness to everyone who knew her. She had been a hard-working woman, dedicated not only to her family but to her community. Her work as a web designer had helped countless small businesses in Willow Creek grow, and her involvement in school activities and local events had earned her the admiration of neighbors and friends alike. Emma had been a woman who gave selflessly, and yet, she had been taken from this world far too soon. The people she had helped, the lives she had touched, would forever carry the memory of her kindness. Sophia Bennett, once Emma's closest friend, now faced the consequences of her betrayal. Although she had received a reduced sentence for her cooperation in the case, the damage to her reputation was irreversible. Sophia's involvement in Emma's murder, while not as direct as Luke's, had been instrumental in the unraveling of Emma's life. Her affair with Luke, her knowledge of his financial troubles, and her willingness to turn a blind eye to the truth had been key factors in the tragedy. Though Sophia had hoped to escape her past, she now had to face the fallout of her actions, and her life would never be the same. The community's trust in her had been irrevocably broken, and she would never again be seen in the same light. For the Caldwell family, the impact of Emma's murder would last for generations. Luke's parents, who had once been proud of their son, now had to come to terms with the fact that their child had committed such a horrible crime. They, too, were left to carry the weight of the tragedy. Though they had not been involved in the murder itself, they would forever bear the scars of Luke's actions. As the investigation came to a close and the legal proceedings reached their final stages, Detective Laura Mitchell and Detective Ryan Carter reflected on the case that had consumed so much of their time and energy. For them, there was a sense of relief that justice had been served, but it came with a deep sadness. No matter how much evidence they uncovered, no matter how many hours they spent piecing together the truth, there was no way to bring Emma back. Yet, despite the sadness, the detectives knew that their work had made a difference. They had helped expose the truth, unmasking the darkness that had festered in the Caldwell family's seemingly perfect life. In the end, justice had prevailed, and though it could not undo the pain, it had at least brought closure to Emma's family. For Emma, the truth had been brought to light, but her life had been cut short by a betrayal too deep to heal. Her children would grow up with the knowledge of who their mother had been, a woman who had loved them unconditionally, a woman who had fought for them, a woman whose life had been taken by someone who should have protected her. The lessons Emma had taught, the strength she had shown, would live on in them, even as they faced a future without her. As for the rest of the town, Willow Creek would never be the same. The idyllic streets, the quaint homes, the sense of safety and security, everything had been shattered by one brutal act. And yet, the community held on. They would rebuild, and they would heal, but they would never forget Emma. Her story, a tale of love, betrayal, and ultimate justice, would live on in their hearts and minds, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of truth. In the end, the story of Emma Caldwell served as a stark warning: no facade, no matter how perfect, could withstand the weight of deceit. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to the surface. Emma had lived a life of integrity, and though her life had been tragically cut short, her legacy would endure. Her story would never be forgotten, a testament to the love and strength she had shared with those around her, and to the relentless pursuit of justice that had finally brought her killer to account.